Blessed are the peacemakers. This year saw the death of John Hume, one of the great figures of Irish politics, who helped take Northern Ireland from tragedy to peace. We examined John Hume's legacy and asked the question, will the peace hold? Join us in the Alex Salmond Show, on air and online.
Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show. In this year of many tragedies, perhaps the passing of John Hume did not get the prominence it deserved. John Hume was widely regarded as one of the most important figures in the recent political history of Ireland, as one of the architects of the Northern Ireland peace process. A native of Derry, he was a founding member of the Social Democratic and Labour Party, the SDLP, and served as its second leader from 1979 to 2001. He also served as a member of the European Parliament and a member of the UK Parliament, and also as a member of the Northern Ireland Assembly. Today, we look at the contribution of John Hume by contrasting the position of disaster reached in the province in the early 1970s at the height of the Troubles with the peace which still holds today, despite the intense strains caused by Brexit. First, we speak to award-winning journalist David Blake Knox about his new book on the killing of Thomas Niedermeyer, manager of Grundig's Northern Ireland factory. And then we examine with Alisdair McDonnell, one of John Hume's successors as leader of the SDLP, about how Northern Ireland was pulled from tragedy to peace. Just after Christmas in 1973, Thomas Niedermeyer was bundled into his car outside his home in West Belfast. He was never seen alive again by his friends or family. It was a nadir of murder and tragedy in the province, with 500 people a year dying as both nationalist and loyalist paramilitaries mobilised against the power-sharing Sunningdale Agreement. Alex takes up the tragic story with journalist and author David Blake Knox, who has published a new book on the killing.
David, this book, where did the gestation of this book come from? The very height of the Troubles, 1973, this dreadful murder. Tell us a bit more about it.
Well, I suppose part of the reason that drew me to this story is, as you say, it was at the height of the Troubles, and I thought it was a very unusual case. It was a case of the only German national to die in Northern Ireland in the Troubles, and the only diplomatic representative of any country to die in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. What also drew me to this story was that it was a family tragedy, as well as being a tragedy, obviously, for Herr Niedermeyer. It was a tragedy for his wife and his two daughters, and all of them subsequently killed themselves in the aftermath of his abduction and killing.
So who was Thomas Niedermeyer?
Well, he was a businessman, but he was quite often described in the aftermath of his abduction as a German industrialist, which kind of made him sound as if he were some sort of fat cat plutocrat. In fact, he came from a very humble or modest working class background. He had been inducted into the German war economy when he was still a child. He was interned while he was still a child after the war ended. Most Germans of his age, he didn't go back to school. He learned a trade. And at the age of just 18, he'd already become a foreman. He worked his way up through the Grundig company, which was then one of the biggest manufacturing companies in Europe. And he eventually became a manager. But he lived in a modest house with a modest income and in many ways some modest aspirations. He threw himself into his work, and by all accounts, he was an exemplary manager. And he also, the factory that he established in West Belfast, or south of West Belfast, the workforce was predominantly Catholic because it was relatively close to Andersonstown, which is a major Catholic estate in Belfast. But there was also a sizable number of Protestants who worked there. And Niedermeyer had the reputation of being scrupulous in his fairness and objectivity and his lack of any prejudice.
So it was, you say that Herr Niedermeyer was the only German national who was killed in the Troubles. It was, therefore, was it unusual for people who were, as it were, working, living incidentally in the north of Ireland to become embroiled? I mean, obviously the innocent victims of bombings and carnage, but was it at all usual for people to be targeted who didn't have a stake in the Troubles?
Well, yes and no. It was very, as I say, he was the only German. And I think there were two reasons why he was particularly targeted. One was that as a diplomatic representative, it was thought that he would carry additional weight in terms of a ransom.
So Thomas Niedermeyer was the honorary consul, and that made him a target. Why was the precise reason that this man was to be kidnapped? What was to be gained from the kidnapping of Thomas Niedermeyer?
They hoped to secure the repatriation of two leading IRA members, the Price sisters, Dolores and Marion, who were very highly regarded within IRA circles.
So how did Thomas Niedermeyer end up being assassinated, effectively?
Well, he was. They called at his house one evening and said that there'd been a road accident to his car. When he came out, he was bundled into another car. He was taken, as it turned out, only about half a mile down the road, where he was held prisoner for 3 days. On the third day, he tried to break a window and shout for help. He was overpowered, and he was pistol whipped, and a post-mortem eventually established that his skull had bbeen fractured.
So it was, in that sense, obviously a killing and a murder, but it wasn't meant to, because obviously there was no value for the IRA in Thomas Niedermeyer being dead.
Exactly. It was a bungled effect. Now, look, it has to be said that any kidnapping, implicit is the risk that someone is being killed, because otherwise there would be no point in. I mean, it's a form of extortion, and if there is nothing at stake, then it's pointless. So there was always a possibility that he would be killed, but they didn't intend to kill him 3 days after they kidnapped him. So
you've spoken a bit about the family consequences. So many tragedies resulted from the death of Thomas Niedermeyer and his kidnapping. Tell us a bit more about the wider impact that rippled through his family and their friends.
Well, what compounded the anguish for his family was that the IRA denied that they had kidnapped him. And even though they had buried his body just a few hundred yards in a shallow grave, just a few hundred yards away from his family home, they were vigorous in denying that they had anything to do with it. So for over 6 years, nobody knew what had happened to him. And because of the insecurity and uncertainty of knowing what had happened to him, they couldn't grieve, really. They couldn't find any form of closure until his body was discovered. And that was through an informant within the IRA who passed on the relevant information. And then they discovered, to their shock and horror, that his body had been lying just a few hundred yards from their home for over 6 years.
So a dreadful human story, tragic consequences. Now, as a journalist and producer, David, you worked your way through both the RTE in Dublin and the BBC in London. I'm interested, from a journalistic perspective, was there a different accent in the way that the Troubles were covered by these state broadcasters?
Yeah, there was at different periods there was different emphasis. There were also more governmental restrictions in coverage of Northern Ireland in Dublin than there were in London.
But you're saying the RTE restrictions were even heavier. Explain a bit about that, David.
Under Section 31 of the Broadcasting Act, it was impossible for us to interview members either of Sinn Féin or the IRA. You know, obviously that restricted, and it was a pretty blunt instrument, and it restricted our coverage in many respects.
One of Sinn Féin's great rivals, great competitors in terms of votes in Northern Ireland was John Hume, who died recently. And yet it was John Hume, probably more than anyone else, who decided that Sinn Féin had to be brought back into the political process if peace was to be established. Now, your dealings with John, obviously, over the years, how coherent a decision was that?
Well, you know, John, I wasn't a close friend of John's, but as you say, I did cover him over quite a long period of years. I think that in many respects, Hume was a moral exemplar as much as a political exemplar. I mean, he was absolutely steadfast and unshakable in his opposition to political violence during some extremely difficult times. And, you know, that part of his legacy, I think, is really precious and should be revered, because he came through a lot of very, very hard times. I think his legacy will be seen to be, you know, as I say, in moral terms, exemplary.
David, I do John Hume as a parliamentarian, a parliamentary colleague, pretty well. I'd never regarded him as a great speaker, certainly not in parliamentary terms. But I happened to be with him in the west of Ireland at a conference in the aftermath of the Omagh bombing in 1998. And he delivered that night not the single transferable speech, he delivered an extraordinary address, spellbinding, which indicated that sometimes people they are touched by greatness, not uniformly, but just at a moment in time. And perhaps, is that something that you saw in John Hume?
I couldn't agree more with you. I witnessed myself some of those moments, sometimes when he was addressing large groups of people, but I also remember one occasion when I had dinner with him, and he spoke with that degree of controlled passion that I found extremely moving and effective. And on that occasion, it almost changed my understanding of John. He was a very passionate person. As you say, there was a sense in which he returned like a dog to a bone at times with certain points, but I would never underestimate the depth of his conviction or his potential for being extremely eloquent.
So lastly, David, as a journalist living through and reporting on and arranging programmes on Northern Ireland, you've seen the nadir in 73, the peace process through. What reflections would you have for the next generation in Ireland? What lessons, from not just from this book, but from your journalistic career, would you offer?
On the positive side, there were periods when people thought that the Troubles would go on forever and that there was no way out of this morass of political violence. And I think that at the very least, we have shown that there are ways forward, that political dialogue and collaboration and accommodation are better ways of solving our problems on this island.
David Blake Knox, the author of The Killing of Thomas Niedermeyer, thank you so much for joining me in the Alex Salmond Show.
Thank you, Alex.
Join us after the break, where Alex will discuss with Alisdair McDonnell, the former MP and leader of the Social Democratic and Labour Party, the contribution of the late John Hume to peace in Northern Ireland. We'll see you then. John Hume was co-recipient of the 1998 Nobel Peace Prize with David Trimble, and also received both the Gandhi Peace Prize and the Martin Luther King Award. He is the only person to receive the 3 major peace awards. Alex examines how he earned those accolades with former leader of the SDLP, Alisdair McDonnell.
Alisdair McDonnell, welcome back to the Alex Salmond Show.
Thank you, Alex. It's always a privilege and a pleasure to work with you.
Now listen, let's start on the early 70s. I've been speaking to David Blake Knox about the killing of Thomas Niedermeyer, the German businessman. That was a period where we were at the effective nadir of the Troubles. I mean, 500 people were dying a year, loyalist paramilitary violence, nationalist paramilitary violence. How did that would be the point at which the Troubles seemed all-consuming?
Well, I think what happened was with the civil rights effort and movement in 1969-70, and basically that was overtaken by people who spun out and resorted to violence, and the violence just fed the violence. And, you know, you had then all sorts of tit-for-tat murders and crazy stuff. We had a Senator Paddy Wilson was murdered, for instance, an SDLP senator in the old Stormont Parliament, and then Stormont had to be prorogued because the Unionists were so resistant to granting basic civil rights and human rights to the nationalist population. And loyalist paramilitary groups responded. The provisional IRA took up violence, started killing those they saw were perceived as enemies, and in turn the loyalists started, and it spun out of control. And it was a great tribute to Hume and to the SDLP at the time that they basically stood out against violence and stood for basic civilized, decent political negotiation, despite no matter how difficult the circumstances were.
Now, as yourself, as a young politician in these days, as a constitutional nationalist, as the term used to be, and the SDLP, with all this violence and mayhem going on and people under personal threat and danger, how did that approach, that somehow the bridge could be crossed, how did that approach develop as you worked with John Hume and others?
Well, that approach was all there, and what was happening almost in a parallel universe to the violence was the steady march of sensible politics. And there was, I think we have to realise that in those days, people's views and attitudes and emotions were all over the place, and there were a lot of people who would have had maybe a sneaking regard for what the provisions were doing, putting it up to unionism, hardline loyalism, but they still at that stage saw the SDLP as the party that was making sense. So, you had that great muddle through the politics at that time, and people got angry, and maybe some lurched in the direction of violence after a violent incident provoked them or annoyed them. But by and large, they were still right through the early 70s and even up until the end of the 70s. The majority approach, if you like, by people was that politics had to be made work.
As one of John Hume's successors as leader of the SDLP, when John was making these overtures, which were deeply unpopular with many, many people at the time, to try and get the men of violence into constitutional politics, to build these bridges, was there a consciousness among you and the rest of the SDLP leadership that you might be politically putting yourself at a disadvantage by bringing a rival nationalist party into respectable politics? Were you aware that you could be creating the circumstances where you'd be superseded by Sinn Féin?
I don't think it was, that was one element. It wasn't the overriding element, though. The overriding element was that there had been many, if you like, low-grade approaches in the past. There had been ceasefires way back in the early 70s that had broken down. And I think the emotional response, if you like, for a lot in the SDLP who were uncomfortable with the Hume-Adams negotiations, discussions, talks, was, can we trust Sinn Féin? Can we trust Gerry Adams? Are they sincere about this? Or is this just a tactical move to buy themselves some time to regroup?
And of course, you must have been aware, as the SDP were under attack for making overtures to Sinn Féin, you must have been aware of the large element and layers of hypocrisy, because British governments had been in secret talks with Sinn Féin, that there was an intimate connection between the loyalist paramilitaries and the forces of government. So these were the people who were attacking the links with Sinn Féin and the SDLP, while simultaneously they had their hands dirty with secret talks.
Well, I mean, nobody ever trusts the British government. They're always double dealing and have their history, and Ireland has been one of double dealing for 1,000 years. And therefore, they were having, of course, back channels all the time. And I think there was a consciousness out there that there were back channels available all the time. But I mean, there was also a consciousness, a very clear consciousness that security interests, both army and policing, had influence over loyalist paramilitaries, and it was particularly the army used loyalist paramilitaries as, if you like, a third force or a fourth force to do their dirty work. And a lot of intelligence, security intelligence, was handed over to loyalist paramilitaries to have them as a fifth column attacking members of the national population. The whole tragedy of it all was, though, that basically it was constantly innocent people that the loyalists attacked, soft targets, anywhere they could find a soft target, people working, people leaving work in difficult areas, or people coming home late at night, walking along a lonely road somewhere. They always claimed that they were attacking members of the Provisional IRA, but I don't think the loyalists ever killed one member of the Provisional IRA. It was always innocent people. And a lot of this was set up and driven by British security interests.
And of course, the SDLP were the rivals of Sinn Féin and were subjected to a great deal of, if not outright violence, then certainly intimidation and many other black arts. So how could you manage, and how could John Hume in particular manage to put that to one side as he tried to embrace people back into a peace process?
The context you got to put it in is, from the beginning of the 70s, there was constant intimidation by people who were given to violence, or people who wanted to support people given to violence. And our canvassers at times were beaten up. I can recall many instances where canvassers were beaten up across the city of Belfast. I was intimidated many a time myself, and I was formally informed by one individual that I know very well that he was going to shoot me when I was canvassing. So all of this all mounted up. That pressure was there, but we always had a vision that there was a brighter future somewhere out there. And we always had the vision that the real politics would ultimately win out.
So how would you assess then John Hume, now he's gone, John, his contribution to getting people to cross that bridge and to solidify a peace process?
Well, I mean, John's contribution was unique and was massive. The combination of himself, Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, and Bertie Ahern in Dublin, they shared a vision over time. You know, they weren't always in the same space, but gradually over time, Clinton, Blair, Bertie Ahern, and Hume were on the one page. And with the four being on the one page, the move towards peace was inevitable almost, because, you know, it was just an irresistible force. And that was the score. And he was a unique individual at a unique pivotal point in our history. And future generations will forever be indebted to Hume for moving us, for moving our politics out of violence. And the Hume legacy is that politics are now top of the agenda, and effectively, to all intents and purposes, the gun has been taken out of Irish politics, and that is a tremendous achievement.
And finally, Alisdair McDonnell, given that all you've experienced through your political career and working with John Hume and the others who built that peace process, what would you say to politicians anywhere who would, for other objectives, whether it be Brexit or Europe or whatever, would do anything at all to jeopardise that prize which has been so hard won?
Well, I have been very angry over the last 2 or 3 years over the whole Brexit thing, because our whole peace process was to a large extent endorsed or underwritten by the European Union. And what happened was that nationalism in Northern Ireland was able, under the umbrella of the European Union, to accept part of the deal that they aspired to and felt secure. We had got economic and cultural progress, and to a large extent, a lot of people were prepared to accept that in the short to medium term, that we had the breathing space to live and prosper in our own country, and that we weren't being marginalised or impoverished by the system that had existed previously. I mean, the problem we had was that previous to the 70s, a lot of those who saw themselves as Irish or had Irish aspirations in Northern Ireland were forced to emigrate. It might have been to England, ironically, or it might have been to America, it might have been to Australia, but we were forced to emigrate. And thus, unionism kept a majority, if you like, politically. And they still do that today in some places.
And your hopes for the future?
My hopes for the future are that progress will continue. I'm a little bit disappointed that greater progress and greater achievements haven't been made in Stormont in the last 20 years. But the fact that the violence has stopped, or the vast majority of it, there's still a handful of people out there who know nothing else and who feel they want to go back to violence, but 95% of it is gone. And people are talking to each other. They may not like each other. They may not even tolerate each other, but they are forced to talk to each other. That's maybe a bit short of making advances. We do need a much more coherent system of government that will bring economic prosperity. The young people today, 17, 18, 19, 20, want prosperity. They want opportunity. And unfortunately, while we've got the violence stopped and got a great degree of stability over the last 20 years, we haven't reached the promised land. We haven't grabbed many of the economic opportunities that are out there.
Alisdair McDonnell, thank you so much for joining me on the Alex Salmond Show.
Thank you, Alec, as always.
The kidnapping and killing of Thomas Niedermeyer was one of the darkest and mostly forgotten episodes of the Troubles. However, it illustrates the nightmarish spiral of violence out of which John Hume and his fellow peacemakers eventually dragged their province by the power of patience, bold risk-taking and force of will. It seems extraordinary that with Northern Ireland having travelled so far towards a civic society, that any politician in London would place it at risk again. The Troubles have cast a long shadow over generations of Irish women and men, but they have also cast a cloud over the politics of England for generations and indeed for centuries. Peace in Ireland is not just a precious thing, but it is a tender flower. It would be best to cherish it, as the late John Hume did so well. May he rest in peace. And now for myself, Alex, and all at the show, stay safe, goodbye, and we hope to see you again next week.